You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskens, your host as always. And this week we have a very special guest in the room. She's someone I've looked up to and admired for a number of years now. She coined the phrase death by 1,000 cuts in a Crown ballroom many years ago to explain what's been happening in our housing market in Western Australia. And she's someone that has very kindly given up her time to give us some more context about her career as well as what's going on from her perspective in the housing market right now. It is Director of Adair Advisory, Commissioner and Non-Executive Director of Stellar Living. Megan, how are you going, Megan?
I'm really good.
Thank you very much for coming in. This is one of a number of expert chats that I like to have on the podcast where we have a bit of a relaxed conversation about a trailblazing pathway and provide some stepping stones along the way for a younger Megan who might be looking to be in your position one day and what it takes to get there. Because I know being young, and I'm sure you'll remember being in that sort of early 20s space, looking forward and sometimes looking about where you might want to be one day, but really having no idea what it takes to get there.
Yeah,
so I'd love to chat about that. And also, let's get candid and honest about what's going on in the market as well. Where did you start?
So I went to Curtin Uni. It was the only place you could study planning at that time. And actually, when I was there, it changed from Waite to Curtin. So I think that was in my first year there. So I did go to Waite for a year.
So you're a planner by trade?
I am a planner through and through. Yes, that is my profession, and it has stood me in good stead for over 30 years in a variety of ways, because it's not just strictly planning. It is a profession and a career path that can take you in many directions, but always linked back for me to planning. I was raised in the country, so I always thought that I would go back to the country. Haven't made it there as a professional as such, but I'm still here. And my first job was with the town of Claremont. I think I was the first planning assistant that they ever gave to Ron Brooks way back in the day.
And what does a planning assistant do in Claremont?
I learnt a lot because it was both building and planning, and you go in raw. I realised very quickly that what I'd learnt in uni I could just put in a box in the garage and never look at again.
I think we all learned that, don't we? We think, what was that all for?
Yeah, what was that? How do you ever apply any of that? It was difficult in being a petite young woman in that role. In the western suburbs, very educated population, knew their stuff. The number of times I went to the counter and was asked, is there a man that I can talk to? Or is your boss around? I got to a point where I was confident enough to push back, and I knew enough.
Because for a while there, you'd be humble enough to say, I was pretty useless for a while. Everyone is going to come at you, right?
Yeah.
But then you get to a point and you go, no, hang on, I can handle this.
Yeah, give me a go. Tell me what your problem is and I'll work out whether I can answer it or not. I experimented because I'm a curious person, and I went up Bayview Terrace and I got myself some glasses frames with no prescription in them. And you know what? It changed people.
Not the first time I've seen that.
Yeah, shocking. Yeah, so what did I learn there? I learned how to really apply things like the R codes as they were then.
What were the R codes?
They were a very basic document that was really very useful in talking about how to calculate setbacks, average lot size and lot coverage, and things like height calculations, which were a bit complex. I remember showing my age, going into the Department of Lands, which was in the state buildings, and getting plans, maps, so you could have a look at the datum lines for the river, etc.
Unscrolling these maps.
Yeah.
And can I ask right off the bat, have the R codes improved since then?
They've changed. I think that they're quite difficult to navigate now. They don't know what they want to be.
It's a cumbersome document now.
It is, and I feel for people, the residents, the community, the ones that are actually trying to raise a voice against some of these developments, because they're reading these documents and trying to interpret them, and they're hard for professionals to interpret, and they're very open to a good argument. A very good advocate can get things through.
There's a whole industry these days, planning lawyers who make a living on interpreting these codes. The bigger the book, the more to argue about.
Yes, I have a daughter that is in that profession now.
There you go.
Yeah.
How long did you spend there and what was the next step?
I was there for a few years. Didn't really know career projection
I guess it's a small office, right? So probably not a lot of growth opportunities unless the person above you kicks the can.
That's right, and Ron wasn't going anywhere. So I moved from there to City of Wanneroo, which was before Wanneroo and Joondalup were split.
So that would have been a growth market back then like it is today, really.
Yeah, big. I went there as a stat planner. So that was very much then my introduction to greenfields and urban sprawl, really.
So what land developments were coming out in the city of Wanneroo back then?
Clarkson. So all of that area around Mindarie. It's gone a lot further than that now.
I remember being in high school and it went from being the Joondalup line to the Currumbine line. And the crazy thing to think is that 18 years later now, the length of train line between Perth and Joondalup is actually shorter now than the length between Joondalup and Yanchep.
Yeah, that's
in
amazing.
Just 18 years.
Yeah. So that was a good move for me because I had a good interface with the precursor to Landcorp, if you like, so the Joondalup Development Corporation. And I met some really interesting people and learned a lot from that. So that whole desire to have Joondalup as a massive centre, it was very young at that stage. Then I left there and went back to the western suburbs for my sins. So I went to Nedlands.
That's a controversial word when you talk about planning and property development in Western Australia these days, the word Nedlands.
Yeah.
Was it a similar environment back then to what it is now?
Yes, I went there when there was a commissioner involved, so the council had been disbanded.
That sounds pretty relevant to today, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it happened more regularly. It seemed to happen, some would say more appropriately then than it does now.
Yeah, wow. And give some great context that sometimes things just don't change in
True.
areas. But I guess in a place like Nedlands where property had been developed since 1910, I remember the Cersei Circle freshwater estate area was being developed by Pete in 1910. Most of the city of Nedlands had probably already been developed by then. What sort of applications are you approving at the time?
DAs.
Houses being built.
Yep.
And I guess that's the reality for a lot of planners is that on a daily basis they're changing between, even today obviously, assessing house builds or subdivisions. And if they
That's
get caught up
exactly right.
or are lucky or unlucky the way that they're looking at it, they might have an apartment building to look at these days too.
That's true. In Nedlands at that stage, it still is the case. Of course, it's not got a town centre. So you're looking at a cemetery takes up a massive part of it. One of the most controversial areas of Nedlands then, and was interesting because I got involved in it when I was on the SPC previously, was the Mount Claremont area. And they had a split coding. They were trying to introduce some development in there, but it was every third block. There had to be two in between. So if your neighbour got in, you missed out.
It was potluck, really.
It was, but that only changed really a few years ago.
Yeah, it does seem like it was one of the last places to have been developed in the city, really. The last frontiers before suburbs met each other, north and south.
Yeah, that's true. So very rapidly went from Nedlands to Subiaco, was involved with the Subiaco Redevelopment Authority interface there and did a scheme and everything. It was a lot of work when I was working at Subi, and then from there went to the department. Now the department, I was only there about 9 months. It was the longest pregnancy I've had, and was then taken into Midland Redevelopment Authority.
There's a theme here of really being on the edge and attracting yourself to, I guess, the most exciting parts of development in our metro area at the time.
Yeah, and Midland was fantastic.
Were you
loved
chasing
that.
this, or did you just end up in these places?
I was asked to apply for that.
Yep.
Here's a nice anecdote. I applied for it. The guy who was my predecessor had been there for 12 months, seconded, had no interest in the job, and was always upfront that he didn't want to be there any longer than 12 months. And so I went in for an interview and was given the job, but was told I wouldn't be paid as much as him. You don't have as much experience. I wrote their scheme and I did everything else. And 12 months to the day, I walked into the CEO's office and I said, "What do you think now?" And he was like, what do you mean? "Well, you wouldn't pay me the same amount." And he looked pretty shamefaced. We're quite good friends now. And yeah, he increased my pay to beyond what it was with the other bloke. But that's the sort of thing that I have competed with throughout my career as well.
Yeah, it sounds like you, by definition, a trailblazer in this state in terms of the themes that you'd like to think aren't a reality, hopefully, anymore in our industry. I'd like to think for the most part, our competencies in terms of making impact in our industry, whether it's private or public, there are some pretty good up-and-coming females in this industry.
There's some
these
great
days.
ones, and they're not always treated terribly well. In a very recent role that I was in, I had the authority and the leadership level that I could take action on a bloke, and I got rid of a guy who was just completely inappropriate in the workplace. You don't walk into a boardroom where there are 3 women and him, and they were asked if they wanted a cup of tea or coffee, and he said, "Oh, I like my tea, like my women, white and weak."
Jesus, I don't know that I would have ever expected to hear that in a boardroom in 2025.
And when one of the women in the room said to him, "What did you just say?" he repeated it. He thought there was nothing wrong with it.
It's certainly not the way that I would like to think most of us in this industry operate. And to be frank, it's a pretty idiotic thing to be saying. It's not going to get you very far, is it?
No, it takes a certain type. He wasn't a young man, and he was set in his ways. There was no way he was changing. So the performance management was really quick and easy.
I guess it leads to the reality that for the most part, or especially in our development space, which I think is probably the last space in our industry, it has been a bit of a boys' club. It's where obviously the money comes from old money for the most part.
Yes.
And it's only now we're starting to see development managers, senior development managers, people like Paige Walker at 5'8", getting opportunities to run some of these companies.
100%. And I do believe that it's taken a lot, and a lot of women, including me, over the years to just keep pushing for that sort of thing. It is that classic thing, male-female response. When asked, how do you feel about this, could you do that? Women will give the honest answer and go, oh, I've never done that before, I'm not sure, but I could give it a go. And men will just go, yeah, no problem, knowing they've never done it. Fake it till you make it. And they get the promotions.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that myself as well.
Yeah.
You mentioned Subiaco redevelopment before. Was that specifically talking to the sinking of the train station?
Yes.
Would you look at that in hindsight and suggest that was an underdeveloped part of our
I think everybody would.
Yeah.
And the original vision for it was to be higher.
What happened?
Classic Perth. What happened to the bell tower? We halve everything to make people feel more comfortable.
Yeah, it's a shame that I guess in one way you want local community consultation to feel heard and to make a positive impact. But at the same time, it also does open up for a committee where nothing ever gets progressed and we end up finding a mediated outcome. And the issue when you think about built form in that space is that a middle ground in built form is one we often regret in 20, 30 years' time.
Yeah, that's definitely a half-baked development. And I know that the Blackburn development in Subiaco has its critics and others that absolutely love it. But that's possibly where it should have been. Unfortunately, it's going to take a long time to redevelop around that train station.
Oh, who knows if it would ever be able to, be frank, given the value in the first place. But what we can say about the Paul Blackburn development and not the John Blackburn development being the initial one is that we know that buildings like this can be a catalyst for gentrification. We know that prior to the development of One Subiaco was dead. Leaseholds were empty. No one really wanted to be around there because nothing was happening since Subiaco Oval left. And it took bravery at a time when it was dead from someone like Paul to be able to put some serious money down, and he has changed for the better forever.
Yeah.
And you'd like to think that there are more opportunities like that coming with the state government's redevelopment around Kitchener and Subiaco Oval, that it can continue to bring more diversity, more density and more options for housing choice in an area that we know is getting more and more expensive and pushing out more and more young and older people from living in the area.
100%.
When we move through your CV, we start to see you take on non-executive roles and board roles. What's the point of spending your time in these spaces? What are you trying to achieve at the end of the day, moving into advisory spaces when you could be still on the ground developing things?
Okay, if we start with the DAPS. So I was one of the original presiding members that was appointed to the DAPS and I got the western suburbs. I did that because I wanted to give back. I wanted to see some change. I was very much behind the premise of why the DAPs were brought in. I thought I'd been in local government. I had seen small p politics have some very poor outcomes and really felt strongly that it was important that you had some objectivity in the decisions that were being made. And I feel that I did make a difference there. I certainly, once I left that area, I had residents that I'd see occasionally afterwards, even in the street, and they understood the decisions that were made, which was good. So I feel like I made a difference there. From there, I was invited to be on the Statutory Planning Committee a year later. So I spent 10 years on the DAPS and 9 on the SPC.
And what sort of applications are you assessing at that level?
Well, everything statutory, same as now. So you've got things from schemes right through to, you do see some policy work, but that's more the commission, or the subdivision, everything that can't be delegated.
Big stuff.
Big stuff, yeah. Important, really important.
And I guess the theme you're providing here is, I guess, starting to move into leadership and guidance.
Yes.
Starting to shape the framework rather than play the game.
That's exactly right. And I think one of the things that I I hope others would feel the same way, that I feel I do well in the meeting space like that, is to sometimes ask the questions, you know the answer, but you need to have it verbalised. You need everyone in the room to hear the answer so that they understand the context better. Because a written report, and it's an issue that goes on across the spectrum for planning particularly, is that there's so much work that's already been done that they forget to be objective in that report writing.
They're so deep into it in the first place.
They are. They come across as these clinical, sterile pathways to approval. And it's not that simple. And planning is a dark art, no black and white about it.
I think it's a bit like refereeing. I used to referee soccer, and even if you had a good day, half of the players on the pitch weren't happy with you.
Yes, that's a good day.
And if you had a bad day, everyone wasn't happy with you. And I think when you're in that planning space, or at least in the decisioning space, it's rare that you have everyone stand up and applaud you for your decisions. It takes some leadership and some bravery to be on those panels and those boards, knowing that at some point in time, whether it's an approval or a refusal, unless it's totally unanimous within the community that it needs to happen. You see even things like the children's hospice, for example. You'd like to think that 95% or 99% of the population would be like, yes, great idea. You still have people that aren't happy with you over something that you would have thought, as a planning leader, this is the sort of thing where you can all just hang our hats on and go, this is great, isn't it? We can do this together.
Yeah, absolutely.
What a strange situation to be in, but I guess that is leadership. It's lonely at the top.
It is. The other thing that I bring to all of these kind of roles is that I have worked in local government, state government, redevelopment authorities and the private sector. I'm one of the few. So I understand, and certainly in mediation situations for me particularly, and I enjoy mediation, so I like to get a good outcome. I was never afraid to have a look at the economic implications and that side of it. And no, it's a very real element for developers. You can't just keep things dragging out or just saying no. And I know I've got my critics. I was one of the ones that said no to Finbar in South Perth. But that was not because of the design or anything like that. When you've got a planning application that had as many conditions on it as that one did, and that had identified the number of issues that still needed to be resolved, like water and traffic, I just seriously felt those should be resolved before you're making a decision to say, yes, this will actually work. You need to know that it's going to work.
So do your homework.
Do your homework.
And I guess that's the tough thing when you're putting an application in that can be quite complex. There's so many referral agencies these days, isn't there? There's always someone who's got an issue, and we're not talking about the community here. We're talking about all the departments, the government departments, fire, water, environment, planning, roads.
Yeah.
And it can be really hard, especially in 2025 where most of the easy ones have been done.
Yes.
To be able to now find a site and go, this is an easy approval. There's rarely a situation where every agency is really happy with this being approved.
That's right, and that's what's making it very complex, and I think is a major contributor to the housing issue that we've got.
Do you think some of it's ideological? Do you think in a lot of cases, obviously development, whether it's from an infill perspective or an expansion perspective, either of them, there's always going to be issues when it comes to environment, traffic, noise.
Yeah.
So you've got all these stakeholders, including the community, where progress in the most part needs to occur in either urban infill and or expansion. But again, there's generally never a perfectly resolved outcome anymore. It's nearly at best a compromise position where you think at least progress is better than nothing here, but it's never going to be perfect. I guess that's the role of this leadership that sits at the board level, at the DAP level, to be able to look above this and not be stuck in the weeds of the silos, the many silos now we have, where it's green light or red light for them.
There's so many weeds. This is exactly where the death by 1,000 cuts comes from, because you've got that many players that you are trying to please, and you cannot please them all. I do feel that there's layers as well, and a hierarchical layer system in it, and everyone feels that they're at the top of it. So what my point is that I'm so important that this has to be resolved before we can do any of the stuff that you're worried about, and each of them feel that way. So is it a compromised outcome? Is it that we end up, we're going to get there, so let's just get on with it? I don't know. And is that a good outcome?
That's the point of the commission, to be able to make those decisions, right? Because someone has to, otherwise no decisions get made anymore.
That's right. So the interesting part about being on the commission is that we do have to look at the bigger picture. So we are part of government, a very important role the Commission plays, but our decisions do have roll-on effects. So it does have an effect on the ability to provide water and power. They're two elements that are serious players in the ability to actually have people living in some of these places, whether it's infill or on the outskirts.
Well, the basic needs, and to be frank, they've been highly criticised over the last 5 years, ever since COVID, and some could say before that, for not being up to scratch and keeping up with the immigration that we've had, and therefore the housing demand that we continue to have.
I'm speculating here because I don't know it as a fact, but it does come across as they were very comfortable doing what they were doing, and they didn't take the responsibility seriously of having to start strategic planning. Some of them still haven't. So they're not planning ahead.
In a time when we certainly need to be. The immigration we've had over the last 5 years, 1 year is more than the 5 years before COVID, let alone 5 years of it now. So if we're in a time where market failure has led us to a 90% of housing supply coming from urban expansion, then absolutely this is the most critical time that planning needs to be occurring. And not only planning, but execution needs to be occurring at a infrastructure level. Things like water, things like power, things like schools and hospitals and all those sort of things. But certainly there's an example right now where there's over 1,000 lots in Henley Brook being built, and there is still no sewer connect to a wastewater treatment plant, which is holding up the clearance of ready-to-develop blocks. Now, you would have thought we'd be a little more coordinated as a state and have a little bit more leadership above these agency levels to say, hey, these are the overall demands we have and the overall requirements we have. Can we make sure we're all doing our job on time, please?
Yeah, it does raise questions, absolutely. So what people talk about the machinery of government, what is that? What do they actually do? What do all these directors general do and talk about? I'm sure it's really important. I'm sure they actually achieve a lot. It's not very transparent. So I know that Paul Lakey is chairing the infrastructure committee, a really important role, and thank goodness he's there because he's the right one to kick a few tyres and say that's not acceptable and that time frame's not okay. And you do need to start looking at planning ahead. Okay, as much as we're a very young country and we're very immature in our ways in many regards, I agree with you. What's going on? How is it that we've got to this point that we can't coordinate outcomes? We all know what one another's doing.
I think at the end of the day that there are so many voices at the table now, which is why there needs to be a state referral unit, for example, simply just to get these voices to talk to each other and compromise with each other so that applications are able to be approved and then moved on to execution.
Don't you think that's the beautiful irony of the fact that you've got a brand new commission, squeaky clean, completely different composition from what it was, which was all of the Directors General, that was what it was set up to do, meant to coordinate all of this stuff.
I'll leave that for people higher than my pay grade to have those discussions. But it is becoming obvious, I think, to the development industry that leadership is very much critical and required at this level. If we are no longer in a situation where we're oversupplied in housing or we are adequately supplied, there are so many levers that need to be pulled, to reference John Kerry, both in the state housing space in terms of looking after the less fortunate of us in the housing continuum, but also just the general goings on of business day to day to make sure that we are building enough houses and that the percentage of houses that are being built is somewhere near our goal of 47% infill. And we know that we are failing dismally at that right now. So I guess the point of these higher up approval pathways, which is removed a bit from the community, is quite jading to a lot of people at a community level, but also quite necessary unless we want house prices to continue to rise and the next generation of people to continue to not be able to afford something that we nearly took for granted only 15 years ago. If you could look back in time over your career at some critical juncture points, is there anything that you would suggest our industry could have been better at, could have taken a more brave leap?
It's an interesting question because I think that very cyclical business, as we know, and I think that everyone got very complacent with those cycles, knowing that we were in a down cycle but the rental market was up, and then the reverse of that. It fell into sync with the mining booms, etc. But then we had that long period of no growth.
No incentive to grow.
No incentive to
or
grow.
Invest.
Yeah, absolutely.
From a public and a private.
Completely. Yeah. And everyone was talking about green shoots, and I was thinking, well, who's got the bottle of Roundup going round behind it, because I don't see any. And then suddenly it changed. It really changed so quickly, and post-pandemic, particularly in that incentive period, which just
mistake.
created a nightmare for everybody. Great intentions, not always well implemented. And then, of course, we've landed where we are. We're in sync with the rental and the property market. It's never been seen before. What could we do better? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that.
It feels like we are a state of people in varying levels of competency and experience, but none of us having the experience that I wish we'd extrapolated from markets that are much more mature than ours to have some foresight and some bravery and just build that apartment building an extra 10 stories or provide that infrastructure before it's required. And you could say that has been done with Metronet, for example. It's a piece of infrastructure that's cost a fortune in today's dollars that no one's really using at the moment, but you'd like to think at some point we'll look back on and go, oh, it's nice it's there and everyone's using it now. Yeah. But at that time, it's probably when places like Henley Brook and Ellenbrook maybe have apartments, and who knows when that will be. You're a leader in this industry. You get to answer these questions with a level of brevity and authority. And what I want to ask you is, from an assessment level, how do you balance the requirements of heritage, environment, and progress? Those three things seem diametrically opposed most of the time. They just don't mix well together. But it seems like a lot of the applications that you'll assess on a daily basis, and probably more and more as you go forward, as they are the less attractive ones that we've left for decades now, and eventually it's all we've got left to do. Those are your factors, right? It's how do we develop something, provide housing for those people that just arrived in a place where we're probably having to knock down some trees, and we may be having to consider knocking down houses or buildings that are quite beautiful.
Yeah, we certainly don't want to repeat getting rid of all of those beautiful heritage buildings down St George's Terrace.
That was shocking.
Oh my God.
And that happened in the 60s, to be frank.
It did.
Yeah.
But that was the philosophy. It's shiny and new. Look at us.
No one valued those places.
No one valued them, which is sad because places like Adelaide did. So if you go to Adelaide, it's beautiful. Maybe they didn't have quite the same impetus, but it was a very wealthy state. So heritage, it is a balance. I understand. Now you look along the heritage train lines and some of those town centres. I think that there's so much opportunity. You don't have to lose all of the character. Character isn't always just about the buildings either. Sometimes it is a bit about scale. Again, it's a complex thing. But just to say no because you don't want any change doesn't have to be a nasty boogeyman and doesn't have to be horrible. I think there's a real role for local government, especially the mayors now, to perhaps come together and work with their communities better and the state government to say we have to have infill.
Otherwise, all our backyards are going to house behind house.
Agree. Let's not have the state government come in and write our scheme for us. Let's us agree how it looks and where it is and how we meet these targets, and everybody get on board. And you may have caps of 6-storey. Maybe that's okay because you've got enough of it.
Yes, like Paris, for example.
Paris is a great example. Barcelona's another one.
And they made those brave decisions 250 years ago.
Yeah.
And we're still seeing 1- and 2-storey places in the middle of Fremantle, 2-storey properties.
That's right. And is there opportunity for the local authorities to come together and with input from the state to perhaps do a trade-off? Like you've got someone, Council X, that's exceeding all of their targets, which is great, and no one's saying stop. But you've got others that possibly should be protected. I feel in some ways for areas of Nedlands, the garden city, all of that, it should be preserved. It's very beautiful. It was designed specifically. But if you're not going to do it, it's a bit like carbon offsets. What are you giving to Claremont who's overdoing it?
That's a great point.
Could there be a trade-off? Because do we have to have it everywhere? We need to start planning.
So again, that's a broader state level leadership space.
Absolutely.
I know that there are many people at that state level who wouldn't have any local planning policies whatsoever. They'd just have one big Brisbane City Council,
they would,
for
I think
example.
That gets talked about very regularly.
And you look at a place like Brisbane City Council, for example, and that's one that clearly is far more progressive than the multitudes of councils we have. They use their river. It's not just for the wealthy. There are apartment buildings all along that river and everyone gets to enjoy it. There are cycle paths on top of the river. Ferries that go back and forth, obviously a slightly different makeup in the way that the river interacts with the city, but there are so many opportunities, I think, that we protect and use excuses like heritage and environment to really veil NIMBYism. And that's not just in the western suburbs as well.
No.
That's across Perth. And you think about environment as well.
Very tough.
Because you get some motive.
We do have climate issues. We've got heat island effects everywhere. And then you've got these pockets, the green lungs, all of these things, all the terms that people use all the time. And then you've got bushfire. And then the 1,000 cuts adds up really quickly. How do you balance it?
We're asking you, Megan Adair.
The
job is genuinely to balance it, isn't it?
Actually,
because it is a balancing act.
Yeah. And again, this comes back to coordination. So you've got to look at where services are put. If they're going to be in an area in road reserves that limit your ability to plant trees, because you've also got a dearth of crossovers, where do the trees go? And then we did go into a very dark spot, in my opinion, where site coverage was so covered on most new housing blocks that there was no room for trees. There was no room for a trampoline. There was no room for anything.
That is the death of land development, isn't it? At the end of the day, it is the path of least resistance with regards to the cheapest form of new supply, and that is always the solution for the state government. But what I've found, unfortunately, and the best metaphor I can use, is it's like putting your child at the dinner table, putting the broccoli on the table and putting the ice cream there at the same time and saying time for dinner. They're always going to go to the ice cream first and say, oh, I'm a bit full for the broccoli, I can't eat it. That's the best way I can explain the development industry. It's always been the path of least resistance to solve the state's housing supply problems, to just open up the next Baldivis, the next Byford, the next Ellenbrook, places that if you look to any other part of the world, probably would never have gone that way.
Certainly not in the time that they did.
Exactly. And it's had massive flow-on effects with regards to traffic. The Kwinana Freeway is a failed freeway these days. You cannot get to 100 kilometres an hour for more than a kilometre until you get past Mandurah, really.
Yeah, that's right.
There are so many flow-on effects with it that you only see once these big estates have been created, that you have to ask, was this any better than a few apartment buildings here and there around Perth?
I think livable neighbourhoods was a good starting spot. I do think, and I'm too outspoken, I can draw the wrath of many, but local government engineers are very quick to then unpick. There's always the ones that want to unpick and go with the, as you said, path of least resistance. It's not always the best outcome, though. So in my experience in the development world, you can start with a Rolls Royce. It looks great, everything's going to work, and it gets whittled down and whittled down. And if you end up with a Corolla, we're not going to fight you, because actually it's cheaper to build and it will sell.
Yeah, and that, I think, is the reality not only for master planned estates, where every piece of road or infrastructure that isn't sellable land is a cost to a development, and therefore making the rest of the sellable land more expensive to sell to the market, but also apartment buildings. It goes the other way, often in apartment buildings where design review panels, for example, gold plate these things. If you're in Europe, for example, next to a beautiful old Renaissance building are essentially now extremely energy efficient rice bubble boxes, and they've gone the opposite way of just being as efficient as possible to get housing out of the ground without any of the beauty. And we seem to be going in a direction where every apartment building needs to be a statement piece and a piece of art.
Agreed.
And it's making what should be the cheaper form of housing in Western Australia the most expensive form per square metre. We're at like $20,000 a square metre for an apartment in the western suburbs. That's untenable for most young people, let alone even downsizers. And when you look at places like Morley, Bayswater, they're not going to get apartments for quite a long time, but when they do, I wouldn't be surprised if those 3x1s or 2x2s are getting closer to $1 million than $500,000. And then you have to think, what young person could afford that? And why would they want to when they could just drive an extra 25 minutes out to Henley Brook and pay the same money for a 4x2? That's what we're faced with as an industry, and I think the design review space doesn't help in trying to provide what really should be basic need and the utility of a roof over our head.
Agreed, and that is something that we are looking at the Commission, is about design review panels, because obviously there's operation statements and things like that about design review panels, and what we are looking at is trying to make it clearer that what actually should go to design review. It's not everything.
Well, certainly not childcare centres. Certainly not commercial centres, things that really don't need to be valued by their visual amenity, but by their servicing of the community.
Yeah, and you come back to something that you raised earlier, like heritage. Yeah, perhaps those should be the things that go. If you're integrating heritage into a new building, then yes.
That's the point of a design review.
Absolutely, to make sure you do it well. We've got some really bad examples.
Yeah. Can I fire some quick fire questions at you?
Certainly.
With quick fire answers?
All right.
What leadership lessons have you learned from your roles on the Commission?
Be brave.
How do you approach complex and contentious planning decisions?
Objectively.
How do you see planning policy evolving in WA over the next decade?
I think it's going to go exactly where it should go. It should become less policy.
Optimistic. What advice would you give a young person entering the industry at the moment?
Go for it. It's a great industry. It can take you in all sorts of places and anywhere in the world, just about.
What motivates you to continue working in the planning and property sector?
Trying to make a difference.
What do you think is the biggest challenge and opportunity facing our industry over the next decade?
Having diverse communities. So, like a country town, I suppose, in many regards, you might have the doctor on the corner and the baker on the other corner and everyone in between.
So it's about trying to bring back the village.
I think so. And people have talked about it in different ways and different guises over the years, and this is not a rapid answer, but it was less homogenous, our cities. I think it would be far more interesting and far more truly multicultural because we can all learn from one another.
You know what? And to break away from the rapid answers and questions, I think a lot of that comes from having such a prescriptive planning code in the first place.
Yes, agreed.
The shorter the code, the more open it is to interpretation, not only from an assessment perspective, but also from a developer's perspective. You're going to see more ideas, more diversity of ideas, and then as long as the planning code isn't so prescriptive that it doesn't allow it, it actually allows someone like yourself to go, that's great, and I actually have the ability to approve this because I'm not having to go down to clause 5.3BC to go, oh, sorry mate, can't use discretion here on this. And therefore we can start using a bit of pragmatism again and let our leaders lead. And I think that's what was happening 70, 80 years ago. We trusted our leaders a bit more rather than putting a book in front of you and saying, computer says yes or no.
That's exactly right. We've become, certainly from a planning perspective, seen as a tick-the-box profession, not people that actually have to think and assess and weigh up the differences. I'm staying in an Airbnb apartment in Leighton at the moment while I'm in Perth. And it's just such a fantastic little community. You've got every age group. You've had people down for a very cold swim in the morning, I think. It's actually got a really good vibe about it. I'd love to see more of that. I think we've got to get away from suburbia.
I agree. And I think and the way we do that is we create villages again. We start to allow the zoning spaces for the small shops, for the repurposing of old buildings, and that obviously has commercial aspects to it as well, but I think the groundwork of that is planning, is providing flexibility for the market, which is the most dynamic truth I think there is. The market is truth, is to be able to then go, geez, we haven't got a gym here, or we haven't got a bakery here. I'd like to put an application in and not have to look through this prescriptive code that says, sorry, computer says X, can't have a bakery here. And you go, if I'm going to put my money on the line here, it's probably because I've done my research, mate. Is it that bad if I'm going to put a bakery here on this corner?
No.
That's where we've gotten to, I think.
Well, I think you're on the money. And of course, the Part 11B is not going to get you there.
That's a shame.
Because you're not over 20 million.
Bakery, who knows? There are gyms getting bigger and bigger these days.
This is true.
And final question on the rapid fire is, how do we balance the community voice with the greater good?
They would argue that their voice is the greater good. That's hard. It does take leadership. I think we need to be clear, and I think you need a lot of intelligence to be able to articulate why the decisions you're making are the decisions you're making and why you consider it to be the greater good.
Communication for the day.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't please all the people all the time, and people won't always agree with you, but it's context, always context. And listening. I do have my mind changed regularly. I went to a meeting recently and I went in thinking I wasn't too sure about this one, and I listened to everybody. And at the end of the day, I was convinced that it was the right outcome.
I think that's all we can ask from our leaders as well, is to listen and then be brave enough to make the decision they believe is best.
Yes.
Final question to tie into that leadership side, and I think it's most critical at the moment with the SPC's work in the Part 11B pathway, which sounds a bit jargonistic. You might be able to explain that to people. What does Part 11B mean? But from my understanding, it is an approvals pathway for bigger projects and projects that the state government would term to be significant or significant to the community, or they matter more than any regular application. Can you explain a little bit about the point of this pathway and who can be involved and how it might expand in the future?
Yeah, Part 11B came about actually as a result of the pandemic. So Part 17 was brought in under the emergency provisions, which allowed the WAPC to make decisions for a period of time that were of state significance and that were shovel ready and could generate employment, push it through, could consider anything. Didn't matter what the scheme said.
Public, private, all those things.
Yes,
Just
and even
doesn't have to be housing.
No, not at all. In fact, I think the first one was an industrial type use and it was an ex-use in a scheme, but it got through because it demonstrated it was going to give employment and it was actually okay. So that was always for a limited period of time. 11B was brought in as a permanent pathway for state and regional significant development.
So is it the same thing?
It's very similar, but we do have to take into account the planning frameworks. We can go beyond them. That's an exceptional discretion. It's got to be demonstrated why.
So there's no more emergency part, essentially.
No, that's right. Yeah. So that's now gone, and this is being worked on. The threshold to get in is it has to be $20 million in the Perth Peel area.
And what would $20 million get you? What are you seeing as the types of things that you're currently assessing?
So we've had some purpose-built student accommodation that was approved. We've had a retirement village multi-res redevelopment and develop in City Beach. We've had just multiple unit developments in other areas, so Wembley, Sorrento. That sort of thing is coming through.
A pathway for apartment developments to maybe be a little less impacted by the local government.
That's right,
opinions.
And perhaps where definitely in these ones the frameworks are a bit outdated and not contemporary enough. The height is always one that comes through, which is always controversial.
Yeah. But also where the assessors probably need to be a bit more experienced to actually make a call on this rather than the local planning officer. Would that be relevant as well to say, hey, this is a big project, it's of significance, we need some big players here to actually give us their...
Yeah, let's say you've got an apartment building you want to put through that does exceed something. You can go to the local authority, you can still choose to go to the DAP, or you can come down this pathway. This one is generally chosen if you've got something that does go beyond a scheme provision, something like height, and that's the easy answer to that question. So the DAs, some would question, should DAs be being considered at the state level? If they are of big importance, then yes, they should.
Things that also, as you said, maybe don't fit the scheme, or there may not be a structure plan, just to allow for, hey, let's be pragmatic
some progress,
about this. Yeah,
and for housing.
Otherwise, we're waiting years for this stuff to get through that we know what the outcome's going to be anyway.
That's correct. So one of the changes that's coming into 11B at the end of this month of May is actually a provision that will allow to disregard the $20 million, though it probably remains relevant, for us to consider multiple dwelling applications where at least 5% of the total number is for community housing, and there'd have to be a community housing provider involved in that. Now, is that social housing or is it affordable housing? It's defined as community housing.
Do you think there are many proponents out there right now who are in that space who aren't already massive developers, who would be above the 20 mil threshold in the first place, who would be brave enough in this market or even be able to make it work financially in this market to be putting FISOs together? I'm not seeing any developments happening smaller than 40 apartments in Perth, not even being spoken about. It seems at the moment the only apartment buildings that can get off the ground are from Blackburn, Finbar, Edge, Willing, who's building his own stuff just to make it work, Celsius. These are all big guys.
Yeah, they are.
Where do we think the next rung of players is coming from where they might be keeping you busy in Part 11B? That's the thing that concerns me.
You won't see smaller players at 11B, and you probably shouldn't. If they're coming to the state government for determination, you're talking big stuff. Yeah. But I think that should open the door for some of the smaller players to be going to the DAPs and back to local government if they feel that's a pathway that will get them an outcome.
Yeah. It seems like a lot of the leadership that's happening right now, especially in the community housing and social housing, affordable housing space, is coming from John Kerry.
Yes.
We've seen those tenders going out to say, hey, anyone that can build all these apartment buildings, I think it was 14 projects. I think that's a program that we lost 50, 60 years ago that I'm very excited to see coming back at a state level and should remain in perpetuity. The state government should be a developer. And John Kerry said this to me personally only a week ago. He said, and we were talking about a childcare centre that's being built in Broome right now.
Yes.
And he said it's our job to step in where there is market failure. And isn't that so true?
Yes, and it always has been the role of government, but we lost it for a while.
Exactly right. It seems like that role wasn't fulfilled for at least a good 15 years, Megan.
At least.
Yeah,
probably longer than that.
Yeah, so it's nice to see it back, but I think as we know, it's going to take, with anything in property, quite a few years before that balances out. In the meantime, your job remains ever exciting, ever dynamic and ever important, ever criticised and ever lauded and it's one that I have a lot of respect for. And given that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your time here today and sharing very candidly your thoughts on the market, your experience over the last few decades in this industry, but also your story so that younger people can look up to you and hopefully be you one day.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, Megan.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!